My name is Joseph Leung, and I am an adult endocrinologist affiliated with UBC and Vancouver General Hospital. Today's topic is on carb ratios, insulin sensitivity factor, or ISF, and sliding scales. Really, the purpose of this talk is to set up all of these topics in order to get to the discussion about insulin pumps. But in order for us to talk about insulin pumps, we really need to have firm footing on our understanding about these topics. So what I want to do today is to review the different types of insulin regimens. And then I want to explain the derivation and the application of carb ratios, insulin sensitivity factors, and sliding scales. For the purpose of this talk and the subsequent talk on insulin pumps, I want to consider an individual who is insulin deficient. So that means that their endocrine pancreas is unable to produce insulin. For example, an individual with type 1 diabetes. But of course, these principles can apply to someone with type 2 diabetes as well. So in this first objective, what I want to first show is this graph on physiologic insulin secretion. So this is a 24-hour time frame, as you can see here. And then over here, you can see that we're plotting plasma insulin levels. And so what you notice here is there is always this baseline level of insulin that the body is producing in somebody who can produce insulin. With each carb intake, we also see that this insulin level spikes. Now, for somebody who is taking basal insulin only, for example, somebody with type 2 diabetes, what we're basically doing is we are mimicking that basal insulin requirement. So this might be the example for somebody who is on just once a day glargine insulin, for example. For somebody who might be on NPH insulin, this is what these curves look like. And as you can notice, it's not very physiologic. And this is why NPH insulin has really fallen out of favor, especially in individuals who are insulin deficient. There may be special circumstances where we might use NPH, for example, once a day NPH in the morning if somebody is on prednisone, which aligns with the pharmacokinetics of prednisone and of NPH insulin, but we're not really going to talk about that too much further here today. And then in this next scenario, you can notice this is a regimen where we're using NPH insulin and regular insulin to try to mimic the long-acting and short-acting effect to try to satisfy the need for insulin with each carb intake. So for example, this morning regular insulin, satisfying that breakfast carb bump up in the glucose, and then that NPH in the morning. The hope is that it will peak around when lunchtime happens, and then likewise dinner and bedtime. But one of the downsides of this type of regimen is, as you can see, it's not very physiologic. The curves of the insulin does not fit with the physiologic insulin secretion very well. And that's why in a regimen like this, you can have a lot of hypoglycemia. This type of regimen, which is a mixed insulin regimen, could also just be 30-70 insulin. So in 30-70 insulin, that's basically 30% of the fast-acting insulin and 70% of the slow-acting insulin. So that's 30% regular insulin, 70% of the NPH insulin. So if you hear 30-70 insulin, that's basically what this is. But as you can see, falling out of favor, as I've mentioned as well. So the more kind of gold standard way of dosing insulin is what we call multiple daily injections, or MDI. So this is one possible regimen of MDI insulin dosing. And in this case, we are using fixed doses for that mealtime insulin or prandial insulin. So we're giving once a day glargine insulin. And then with each meal, we're giving lispro insulin, so this rapid acting insulin as well, to satisfy that need for insulin with each carb intake. You can also further refine the dosing of that short-acting insulin, that rapid-acting insulin, by doing carb counting. So really matching that dose of short-acting insulin, rapid-acting insulin, to how much carb is consumed. And as you can see, this graph hugs that line, that physiologic insulin secretion area under the curve better than this fixed dose regimen. And so this is a very well accepted way of dosing insulin in an insulin deficient individual, for example. So now that we've talked about these different types of insulin regimens, what I want to do is talk about carb ratios, as well as ISF sliding scales. For that last case, this scenario where we really want to precisely dose insulin. And this will be a prerequisite to knowing how we might program the settings on an insulin pump. So this first concept I want to talk about is, why is insulin given? And so insulin is given for three main reasons. The first is for that basal requirement. So to address that constant need for just a little bit of insulin that is secreted at all times from the pancreas for a number of reasons, for example, to prevent acidosis. And we typically use a long-acting insulin or a basal insulin for this. And then the second reason for giving insulin is for nutritional insulin, a prandial insulin, mealtime insulin, and insulin bolus. So this is to address carbs, for example, from oral intake, and we use short-acting insulin for this. The third reason for dosing insulin is for correction. So that is if the blood sugars are high, we need to give some short-acting insulin in order to bring that blood sugar down. And I really want to distinguish between these last two scenarios, bolus insulin and correction insulin. Because sometimes we need to give insulin because an individual is taking in carbs and their blood sugar is high. Sometimes we give that short-acting insulin only because they are taking in carb, but their blood sugar is not high. Or sometimes an individual is not eating carb, but their blood sugar is high and we need to give short-acting insulin, or sometimes neither. So they're not eating carb, they're fasting, and their blood sugar is also within the target range. And so in that kind of a situation, we don't need to give any short-acting insulin. It's good to distinguish between these reasons. So first, let's tackle basal insulin. So typically, basal insulin is given once a day when it's given by injection, and that basically means that the basal rate, there's only one basal rate that's possible. Example, let's say we're giving glargine insulin, 24 units once a day. That basically means that they're getting 1 unit per hour. And we can't really modify that. We can't be like, oh, between the first, 12 hours, we want to give 1.2 units, and the last 12 hours, we want to give 0.8 units. No, we can't do that with insulin injections if we're giving basal insulin just once a day like that, because that's not how injectable insulin works. Now, can we give basal insulin and achieve two basal rates? Maybe that's possible. An example would be using the longer acting insulin Detamir, or brand name Levemir. As I mentioned in a previous talk, that insulin will be decommissioned and discontinued worldwide in a matter of months, certainly by the end of 2026. But just as a thought experiment, if you were to give, for example, Levemir maybe 15 units in the morning and 9 units in the evening, you might achieve two different basal rates. So in that daytime period, after that 15 units was given, you might have a higher basal rate in the daytime, and then overnight you will have a lower basal rate as well. But basal insulin given through an insulin pump, we can actually much more precisely control those basal rates. And so in the next talk, when we talk about insulin pumps, we can actually specifically program between this time and this time, we're going to give, 1 unit an hour. And then for the next 4 hours, we're going to give 1.2 units. For the next 4 hours, we're going to give 0.8 units. And for the next 6 hours, we're going to give more precise dosing of insulin. So that might be one reason of going on insulin pump is to more precisely dose that basal insulin like that. The other concept I want to talk about is about checking the basal rate. And so if we want to see if that basal rate is adequate or not, we could ask an individual to not eat anything. I mean, you could ask them to do it for the whole day, but that would be quite difficult and uncomfortable, perhaps. But if the blood sugars are stable at the time when they're not eating anything, then that implies that the basal insulin is dosed properly, whether that's by injection or by insulin pump. If the blood sugars are rising throughout the day, even though an individual is not eating anything, that implies that the basal rate is not high enough. Or if the blood sugar levels are going down throughout the day and an individual is not eating anything, any carbs, then that implies that that basal insulin, whether by injection or by pump, is too high. So that is basal insulin. Now we're going to move on to bolus insulin or nutritional insulin, mealtime insulin, prandial insulin. So you can do bolus insulin by fixed dose. So for example, you can say Lispro insulin 5 units per meal. Quick and dirty. Sometimes we do this in somebody who might be newly diagnosed and they haven't been trained in carb counting yet. So this is just one way that they can dose that bolus insulin. However, perhaps a more precise way of dosing this MDI insulin is to use what we call a carb ratio. So the carb ratio can be calculated by this equation. Carb ratio equals to 500 over the total daily dose of insulin. And so that's where knowing that total daily dose of insulin can become really, really important. So what I want to do is show you an example of the algebra with this equation. So let's say an individual's total daily dose of insulin is 25 units. So 500 divided by 25, that tells you that their carb ratio is 20. Or if, let's say, their total daily dose of insulin is 100, so that's you add up all the basal, all the bolus insulin, all the insulin that they're using a whole day, and it's 100 units of insulin, well, 500 divided by 100, that's 5. So that tells you that the carb ratio is 5 or 5 grams. Now, what does that actually mean? What, if somebody's carb ratio is 20, if somebody's carb ratio is 5, what does that actually mean? Well, this is how you would interpret or apply that number. So when somebody says, my carb ratio is 10, what they really mean is that 1 unit of insulin addresses 10 grams of carbs for them. Now, interestingly, when you put that through this algebraic equation, that tells you that their total daily dose is 50 units, or it implies that their total daily dose of insulin is 50 units. Okay, that's rather interesting. We're just going to park that thought for a moment. We're now going to move on to correction insulin. This is where we'll be talking about the ISF, or insulin sensitivity factor. But before we talk about correction insulin for high blood sugars, let's talk about low blood sugars. So if somebody's blood sugars are too low, so less than 4 millimoles, that's corrected by taking in sugar. So for example, 15 grams of Dextabs, that's something like 4 Dextabs, or they can take some juice. A typical juice box has somewhere between 20 to 25 grams of carb or sugar. So they might take in, for example, half or 2/3 of a juice box. If the blood sugars are too high, though, that's where we need to give additional insulin in order to bring down that blood sugar. And that's where we might use this insulin sensitivity factor, also known as an ISF, or a sensitivity factor or a correction factor. And here we have another equation. And this is where that ISF equals to 100 divided by total daily dose. So once again, that total daily dose of insulin is very important. And so once again, we're going to explore this equation a little bit here. If that person is using 25 units of insulin per day, that will imply through this equation that their ISF is 4. If they're using 100 units of insulin per day, that implies that their ISF is 1. And so what does an ISF mean? Well, if somebody says, my ISF is 2, what they really mean is that 1 unit of insulin brings down their blood sugar by 2 millimoles. Once again, interestingly, this implies that their total daily dose of insulin is 50 units per day. So when somebody tells you their ISF, they're actually making some implications about some things. I think the other very interesting thing here to notice is that ISF and carb ratio equations look kind of similar. And how it's similar is that a carb ratio is about 5 times that of an ISF. Or in some textbooks, it might be 4.5 times of the ISF. So if you notice somebody's carb ratio is 2 times of their ISF, that tells you that, that's a little bit of a red flag. Maybe um, things are a little bit off, and that ratio between the carb ratio and the ISF is not quite right, and something there needs to be adjusted. Either their carb ratio needs to be higher or their ISF needs to be lower. The other thing that I want us to realize is that the carb ratio and the ISF are actually denominators. And I'm going to get to that in this slide. So how do we use an ISF? Well, there's this third equation here. The insulin dose is equal to their current blood sugar minus their target blood sugar divided by their ISF. So for example, if their current blood sugar is 14 millimoles and we're trying to get to 10, and what we do is 14 minus 10, that's 4, divided by, let's say the ISF is 2. That means that 14 minus 10 is 4, divided by 2, that's 2. So they would get 2 units in that kind of scenario. But let's say we're trying to target a lower blood sugar, 8. So 14 minus 8, that's 6. 6 divided by 2 is 3 units. What if we change that ISF? So what if we went down in the ISF number? So let's do this calculation here. 14 minus 10 is 4, divided by 1 is 4, 4 units. So comparing this upper left-hand corner to this lower right-hand corner here, when we go down on the ISF, we're actually giving more insulin. So going down on the ISF is actually making the ISF stronger. And likewise, if we go up on the ISF, we are making it weaker, which means they're going to get less insulin. And the same goes for carb ratio. If the carb ratio is a higher number, it means that they're going to get less insulin. And when the carb ratio is a lower number, they're going to get more insulin. Okay, so now during this last part of this talk, I want to talk about sliding scales a little bit. So I want to present you with this particular sliding scale where the blood sugar is down one side and how much insulin we may dose. So in this sliding scale, what you notice is that there's a target sugar here. It's 8 because it's really starting above 8 where we might give them some insulin. So remember this algebraic equation that I showed in the last slide. What we can actually do is plug in the current blood sugar, the target blood sugar, and the insulin dose that's recommended by the sliding scale, and we can actually solve for ISF. So what we're going to do here is at each one of these levels, we do this equation, and what we realize is that the ISF in this sliding scale is 2, and it's 2 across the whole spectrum of the sliding scale here. So it's a linear relationship. Now I'm going to present to you a different sliding scale here. And in this particular sliding scale, there is actually an inflection point. So initially, that dose of insulin goes up by 1. So 2 units, 3 units, 4 units. But above 14 millimoles of glucose, it goes up by 2. So 4, 6, 8, 10. So this is very interesting. In this particular sliding scale, we observe that there are two different ISFs. Between 8.1 to 14, that ISF is 2, and then between 14.1 and 18 or greater than 18, what we notice is that ISF is 1. So this means that when the blood sugar is higher, they're going to get more insulin proportionately. And this might owe to a concept that we call glucose toxicity, where as the blood sugars are higher, we actually need more insulin to get that blood sugars down because the high blood sugars have kind of poisoned or caused the cells to be kind of toxic. And we need actually more insulin in order to kind of detoxify that situation and to bring those blood sugars down. Here's a third sliding scale here. And in this particular sliding scale, as we're doing the math, I've done it all for you here, we notice that there's actually two different inflection points, meaning that there are three ISFs. Over here, the ISF is 2, over here, the ISF is 1, and over here, the ISF is less than 1. Now, I'm now going to put all three of these sliding scales that I presented side by side. And what we note here is that this is just the sliding scale power plan or the pre-printed order before we had the electronic medical records at Vancouver General Hospital. So this is what the pre-printed order used to look like when we were still using paper charts. And I wanted to just show something very interesting here. It actually says directly on this pre-printed order which of these sliding scales to select, low, medium, or high, depending on the total daily dose of insulin that that individual is using. So this is super interesting, that relationship that I talked about total daily dose of insulin and then the ISF. Well, it looks like here that that relationship comes into play in the generation of these sliding scales. And so with this knowledge in hand, you can now actually create your own custom sliding scales. Creating your own sliding scales is a bit of an art, but before you do the art, as I like to say, before you do the art, you need to know the science behind it. So the hope is that during this talk, you've learned a little bit about how sliding scales work, what the relationship is between sliding scales and ISF, as well as the relationship between ISF and the total daily dose of insulin. So in this talk, we have reviewed different types of insulin regimens, and then we have proceeded to talk about carb ratios as well as ISF and sliding scales as well. See you in the next talk.